Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. One question we really wanted to ask someone like you is, does the Maimonidean path lack spirituality?
Mhm. Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to be able to have an opportunity to speak with you both and to be on the podcast. And so, thank you very much for having me on. The question about, in honesty, I find the question very interesting because it wouldn't have even occurred to me that there should be such a question. Does the Maimonidean approach to Torah and mitzvot and so on lack spirituality? For me, in my involvement with it, there's no question about that. Of course, the question whenever somebody speaks about spirituality is, what do you mean by spirituality? So I would challenge you to explain that a little bit more. What do you mean by spirituality?
Well, what I mean is what the common person would say is like the ruchniut of, let's say, like the Chassidut has to offer. They have a more, let's just call it inspirational Judaism, where there's a constant there's a constant need for inspiration, number one,
Mhm.
and keeping people engaged. Or
Right. So inspiration is built, right? That word is in spiritu, right? It is that one has spirit within, right? That's what inspiring means. So I can get why it is that you're saying that. And if you're looking at spirituality as being a kind of inspiring experience in terms of in terms of what it is that's being taught and the framework of thought and practice, I mean, honestly, for me, the most hands down single greatest inspirational teaching in my life is HaRambam. And that is because HaRambam teaches a life positive, clear, uh, full framework of what it is to live as a member of Israel in the world in covenant with God. So if that is one's goal, right? In other words, if one wants to be a full-fledged, conscious Jewish person in covenant with God, my opinion is that you can't get better than HaRambam. Because what you need in order to be able to do that is to be able to know what you're doing, right? To understand what is the framework of the covenant. What are we expected to do? How am I as an individual seen within that covenant? How am I as a member of Klal Yisrael seen in that covenant? How do I relate to the mitzvot of the Torah that are presented to me? And there is no one, and I say that, with pause and consciousness, there is no one like HaRambam who has treated the entire Torah, meaning all of the mitzvot and its framework, in consistent approach, like he has. And of course, yes, a person can study through the entire Talmud together with the Torah Shebechtav. It's a very great ordeal, and the Talmud itself is a vast sea of information and intricacies, right? So the Masechtot are called Masechtot because they're weaves, essentially, of thought and law and a very specific way of presenting ideas. But it's also left open, right? It's also left kind of open to interpretation. The reality is, and I say this frankly, HaRambam is much less open to interpretation. People can always put their projections onto whatever it is that they're reading, but HaRambam is a specific approach in that. And the reason why the approach is inspiring to me and indeed spiritually uplifting to me is because if I'm living in this paradigm, my interest is to be able to be the best that I can be, right, in this endeavor. And HaRambam gives me tools for that like no one else. So if it's a question of what the law is in any particular situation, I always look to him as an origin, because there's no law that is in the corpus of Jewish law that HaRambam does not in some way treat. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of modern law that HaRambam didn't know about nor speak about, but the source of it all, the principles of it all, is presented by him, and it's presented by him in very specific context and meaning, and therefore meaning. And HaRambam also, if you study the Moreh Nebuchim, you have a very strong sense of the inspirational covenant and relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his attention to us and our work in terms of developing that relationship and so on. So it may be true that if people are questioning that, there may be they may be lacking scholarship. a little bit in terms of HaRambam, what is they're looking for, or they may be looking for something else, right? Outside of what it is that I've just described. They may be looking for just some kind of motivational pep talk or something in order to be able to get through, which I also find, in HaRambam's works. It's very rare that the end of a set of halachot will not have an inspirational and meaningful encouragement and framing of what it is that we're doing, given the set of laws that are being presented. So I don't recognize the question, right, to begin with. And if there is a question for people, I would say one of two things. I would question whether indeed that is what their goal is, right? Meaning to be able to live in full covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in clarity of its framework and our personal position within that. If that's what their goal is, I think everything is there. And if not, then maybe there's something else. And the second is just maybe scholarship, right? I mean, HaRambam's works they don't have pages of inspiration. In other words, he didn't write, here's a book of inspiration, which may be what Hasidut kind of attempted to do in its own way, given the circumstances, But if you read through HaRambam, and you have to find what's written about approaching a relationship with him and what's open to mankind, like he writes at the end of Shemitah V'Yovel, or you listen to what he writes about happiness and joy in life at the end of Hilchot Lulav, or you listen to about what he writes about the meaning of mitzvot at the end of Hilchot Ma'ilah and Hilchot Murah. You need to read it. You need to be able to find it. But it is in the study of his whole work that one finds this. So for quick fixes or for kind of, a treatise on inspiration, yes, one might be wanting, in terms of how it is that HaRambam puts things out. But if one is consistent and studies the entire framework as he presents it, in my opinion, there's nothing more inspiring and nothing more profoundly moving. I've mentioned several times in various, kind of classes that I've given or talks that I've said, I mean, when I held a page of the Moreh Nebuchim in my hand when I visited Cambridge in the Geniza, they put this paper in my hand, right? It was basically held in thin plastic. They put this, and I of course recognized HaRambam's handwriting. I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it was a letter or something. And I looked down and the person said, that's a page from the Moreh Nebuchim. I started crying. I was so deeply moved that this man who had spent all of this time to write for me such wisdom, such guidance, such profound truth, to me generations later, right? Obviously not to me personally, but knowing that somebody might, and of course I was moved to tears. So I'm not sure that I recognize the question, but
so I think if I have to give it a little bit more detail, and again, obviously it's not our view, but it's the view that we hear from many people, is that there seems to be this, since there's this, it feels as if there's a distance between man and God versus, let's say, the Kabbalistic and Hasidic tradition, where God is immanent, and there's this, people feel like they can't connect to the God of HaRambam because it's maybe too distant, and there's an unbridgeable gap.
It's too hard to get there.
Yeah,
I think that's also false. I think that if people study Kabbalah appropriately, they recognize that even in Kabbalah, the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to do with our commitment to the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? I don't want to get into the the nitty-gritty details of halakha, but there is definitely even a concept with regards to the sefirot and how it is they manifest in hashgaha, that there is a withdrawal of sefirot. Right? It's called tlat klilan betlat. Right? That the which essentially is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's engagement and involvement hashgaha just recedes. It's based on the pasuk lo yegurecha ra, right? That evil cannot touch you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in terms of Kabbalah, how does it say? It says HaKadosh Baruch Hu withdraws. In the Torah itself, it talks about hister panim, right? Ani astir panai mehem. What does that mean? That means that we have to work in order to be able to build close relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yes, of course, there is a default of brit for every single member of Klal Yisrael. But that's the default. So of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will not just forsake his people, But that's the enterprise of Israel, right? That is the corporate entity that is Klal Israel. But you and me as individuals, of course, there's a requirement and an expectation that we build in terms of that relationship. Consider the fact that if the relationship was always full on, right, the highest levels, there would be no room really to talk about a relationship. It would just be status quo. It would just be what is. So that's the case with every relationship. And what people believe is that HaRambam holds that it's very difficult to get in contact with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's false. It's just that HaRambam takes it very seriously, right? He talks about the relationship as we would any meaningful and serious relationship of our life, right? And that is expected. That's part of it. We are meant to extrapolate the relationship dynamics that we have with deep, intimate loves, as we would with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? In other words, how those relationships would run with us as we would run with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why Shir HaShirim, as HaRambam writes in the end of Hilchot Teshuvah, Mashal hu ledavar zeh, right? The whole Shir HaShirim is essentially a metaphor for the relationship they were with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and all of Shir HaShirim is a story about this deep, intimate love between a man and a woman. So, of course, relationships are serious and meaningful. These are not, I don't want to use the word childish, because that makes childlike things not valuable. But they are not elementary. Yeah, they are complex. They're sophisticated, and the more that we take seriously the relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, the more deep and intimate it will be. But no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even according to Rambam, is not far off somewhere. He's there. He's imminent. It's there. He's waiting for us. He's relationship ready. He's interested in us being engaged with him. And HaRambam writes in Hilchot Teshuvah, there is nothing that stands in the way of Teshuvah. Anything, even the worst things, Teshuvah is always an option for us. Yeah. So again, very inspiring, very moving, very meaningful. But HaRambam also does not treat the relationship with God and the Torah itself, for that matter, as a kind of an elementary, minor, negligible thing. It's very serious for HaRambam. It's a very real thing. And in the same way that when we love someone, everything matters more, not less. Right? When you love someone, or when somebody loves you, and you're in a loving relationship with somebody, they don't say good morning. It means something. You have a coworker who forgot to say good morning to you. Okay, not the end of the day, not the end of the world. You're not going to sit there unless you've got kind of concerns about that in general. You're not going to sit and ruminate on it all. But if your wife or your husband or a deep love of your life doesn't say good morning to you, that's catastrophic. It's catastrophic. So things change. So you're going to say, oh, it's so hard. Yes, relationships are difficult. They're responsibilities, they bear weight, and so on and so forth. So I disagree that it's harder as far as HaRambam. HaRambam gives us, he writes constantly that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there and available and interested and wanting Israel constantly. But he doesn't water down the reality of the nature of the relationship. The relationship requires commitment, dedication, work. Yeah.
Beautifully said.
Thank you. Okay. We wanted to ask the Rav if we're wondering, how would a Maimonidean community look like? There's not much, at least not that we know of. There's not too many Maimonidean communities today. Most people that subscribe to the path of the Rambam, it's more individualized to themselves. What would be how would the parameters and how would we implement realistically a Maimonidean community today?
Right. Well, I mean, I guess that there are probably two aspects to that really inherent in what it is that you're asking, because there is a philosophical aspect and then there's a halachic aspect, right? Not to divorce the two. I mean, for HaRambam, they're not divorced, right? They're the same, which again is part of the beauty of his whole approach. But I think that in modern normative Judaism today, it's been quite some time since HaRambam sealed his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah. And so much has happened since then. Right? So it's important. First of all, one of the major things that happened since then was the Shulchan Aruch. Yeah, that Rabbi Yosef Karo, Maran, he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch was not a minor wave in the world of Jewish law and practice.
Right.
So, your question would, without saying it, would kind of assume that we would kind of like park, Has Shalom, I'm not saying we should do that, but would park the Shulchan Aruch, take the Mishneh Torah as the predominant,
Right.
legal.
Those are challenges. Those are
right? So those are not minor issues,
yeah.
right? Those are very, very, very serious things, and I'm not even advocating for that. I'm not necessarily saying that that's what it is we should do, because I think also that the process of history of the Jewish people is not a minor thing either, right? I mean, we have to take into consideration the effects, and the manifestations of various things, and that's obviously it's theological, it's a bit esoteric. I get that. I'm putting that forth, and there are many, many, many people that would disagree with me, many significant scholars, Chachamim, that would disagree with me, and probably some even that would call me off my rocker for saying that. But what I'm saying is that the historical developments of the Jewish people are not negligible, right? The fact that Rabbi Yosef Karo, his work, came to be within us as it did, not saying that there aren't issues kind of that we struggle with sometimes, but it is what it is. It's there. And I certainly would not advocate kind of disregarding that, Has v'shalom, not only that, but what, in my opinion, would be a tremendous lack of kavod hachamim. I mean, Maran, I think about I envision a man sitting at a desk with a candle at night and a quill in his hand, writing the Bet Yosef. For that work alone, it takes a bit of, reverence and deference, for that matter, to him. So we're not practically in a situation. And I will say on the back of that, which I think is important, is that, how do I frame that? Without getting too long with it, remember that the bedrock covenant with the Jewish people is the covenant of Abraham Avinu. It's what everything is built upon. Everything, every subsequent Brit, every law, everything is built on the Brit Abraham Avinu. And the Brit of Abraham Avinu is not with Abraham and his students. I cannot stress that enough. It is not with Abraham and his students. It's with Abraham and his children. It's with his family. And that means that if there is any core element of the Jewish people, of Am Yisrael, it's the people. And that means that to some degree, we must recognize that being part of the people as they are is in and of itself a value, right? Now, that's not to say that if we see the collective going wrong, right, or if we see the collective is going on a path that isn't necessarily righteous or appropriate, then we shouldn't say something, do something, fight it, and so on. There's no lacking of that in Jewish history, I mean, Hanukkah is that for all intents and purposes. We literally celebrate that on Hanukkah. But still, being part of the klal is not a minor value. And the klal has accepted certain things, right? And even HaRambam recognizes that there is a certain value to the Kabbalah-oriented, right? What it is that the Rov Yisrael, right? How it is we have approached things. So I'll give you an example of this. He in the Mishneh Torah, HaRambam rarely ever writes anything that is not his understanding of the established law of the Talmud, right? That's how the Mishneh Torah. That's what he puts for the Mishneh Torah. And interesting, of all laws in Hilchot Hanukkah, right, which I said is a moed that recognizes the fight of one group of Jews against other group of Jews and the vindication of the group of Jews that are fighting for Torah, over those that wanted to leave Torah, so on. He writes how it is that we're supposed to do the lighting of the nerot, right, on Hanukkah, and he presents his understanding of the sugya of mehadrin and mehadrin mina mehadrin, right, the ones who beautify the mitzvah do this, and the ones who beautify it further do this, and he gives his whole analysis of the sugya, how it's supposed to be practically understood. And then at the end of that he says, however, minhag bechol arenu sfarad, He says, however, the actual practice in all of our cities in Sfarad is not like I'm writing, it's like this, right? And he puts it into the Mishneh Torah. He includes that. Well, so you could argue and say, yeah, but you're HaRambam, you understand that Sugya is this, that's the Din HaTalmud, then that's how it should be. Forget about the Minhag. Why doesn't he combat the Minhag and say, yeah, this is what we do, right? This is what everybody does. And there's value to the fact that the collective has decided that this is what it is that we're doing. And then there's certain things that, we wait for history to be able to determine. But think about the Jewish people as well. The Jewish people are the most individualistically minded people, right? We don't take things easily. We don't do things in unison well. It's a challenge for us. It's like the old joke about the two shuls, and so on and so forth. You've got one guy in a desert island. There's a shul that he goes to, and then the shul that he doesn't go to. To find, given that kind of tongue-in-cheek reality, things that have spread across the Jewish world in practice and accepted in unison is, again, I'm suggesting, is not minor. I'm not saying that it should be chok v'lo ya'avor, immovable, but it's not minor. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate creating a community that is solely and completely based on the Mishneh Torah. HaRambam lived when he lived, and there's been development in the Jewish people since. And we have to recognize we're not going to erase, hundreds of years of history post HaRambam just to be able to establish that. That's not to say that I don't certainly advocate, recognize. Nobody needs me to do that. I'm certainly not the guy doing that. I mean, Chacham Ovadia Yosef, in his introduction to the Shelot Utshuvot Pe'er Hador, which are Tshuvot of HaRambam, which was put out by his son Chacham David Yosef, Chacham Ovadia writes that if there is a teshubah that we find of HaRambam that goes against the psak of the Shulchan Aruch, we go like the teshuvah of HaRambam over the psak of Shulchan Aruch, because and we could say that if Maran saw the teshuvah of HaRambam, he'd be posek like the teshuvah of HaRambam. So there's no question, even with the Shulchan Aruch, HaRambam is very major. It's a major, 80% of Shulchan Aruch is just the words of HaRambam. So look, I mean, there are adjustments that happen. There are elements that HaRambam was posek in his understanding of the sugyot of the Talmud that in general we don't do. We follow rather how it is that the Shulchan Aruch established it. And I say that to be part of Klal Yisrael and to practice as the majority of the Klal are practicing, unless it's something that is mamash, absolutely wrong and against how it is. If there's no possible way to understand the Talmud that way, which is usually not the case, we shouldn't forsake that. We shouldn't forsake that easily. Yeah, I'm not saying it should never be done, but we shouldn't easily forsake it. And I think that to create a community that is solely practicing HaRambam is not necessarily the best thing to do. Again, I say that knowing that there are many Rambamniks out there that think I should be burned in effigy for saying that. But nonetheless, that is my private opinion. However, I would say that that in general, the philosophical approach of HaRambam to Torah and to mitzvot and to again, I use the word framework of Jewish practice and thought as the framework should be advocated, and that should be done more. And I do think that it's happening in various places. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very proud of the Habura. I mean, one of the reasons we started the Habura was because we wanted to be able to put the thought out, right? To be able to have a framework of thought, to be able to understand their approach to the Brit, to Kadosh Baruch Hu, to being part of Klal Yisrael. That I think is, I use the analogy, the volume has been turned down on it for a very long time. And I want to turn the volume up on that and be able to give that, opportunity for people to be able to kind of be part of that thought world. Right, that frame of thought. If that, I hope that answers in some way.
And actually, I think it's a great answer, and I think really when we talk about a community, we're not really I wasn't at least talking about instituting the halacha of the Rambam, because even Maran mentions that if you're a community that follows HaRambam, you shouldn't stop.
Yeah.
So it's not really about that. It's really about the philosophy. It's really about the outlook. Because we find today that there are communities that adopt a lot of, let's say, practices that are kind of shaky or maybe a little bit superstitious, not from the classical tradition. So So that's really where I want to understand, how do we kind of, because it feels like almost what he was alluding to, Benti was alluding to, was that there's kind of like a
Hesitant.
hesitation because people feel like, by
Yeah.
by introducing Maimonidean like philosophy,
Mhm.
way of living, you're kind of attacking, the traditional modern view.
Yeah, so no, honestly, as far as that's concerned, I have to say, lo taguru mipnei ish, right? You can't be afraid. You have to recognize that. I mean, that's one of the reasons also I love reading HaRambam. HaRambam wasn't afraid. HaRambam said it like it was. He didn't care. He was straight out. So first of all, I think the self-consciousness that you are describing, right, about how it is that people will respond and the way that people, that is helped by greater learning, right? So the more that one learns and understands that this is the way that things should be and why, and has strong reinforcement for it, you can't see another way. I mean, you can't even allow yourself to really be able to engage in it. And not only do you not, you recognize how serious it is to do an alternative, right? To behave in the alternative, and how much it shouldn't be done, right? And that's truth. And so what we need, first of all, is a lot more learning. Which again, I don't mean to plug it, but I'm grateful and proud of the Habura that it's there, right, and that people can use it, and that it's available and does provide a good framework. But you also need to consider who it is that you're hiring, or who it is that you're asking to lead, right? So it requires leadership. It requires strong leadership and brave and courageous leadership. But it also has to come, that bravery and courage has to come from very well-rooted, strong, old principles. And that's one of the things that we do with the Habura. We point to the sources, right? It's not just, this is, some idea where we want to be rational. We want to be rational. Rational is overrated. Honestly, I'll tell you, it's not about rationality, because rationality fails in many areas. It just doesn't work. There's certain things that rationality doesn't function for in the world. But it's not about that. It's about what is our derech. What is our way in Torah? And our way is old. It is old. It is populated by some of the greatest hachamim of all time. And it's something we should be proud of, not afraid of. It's something we should be proud of. We should know is well-founded. It's not new. It's not some new way of ideas that we're coming and putting out because we want to be modern. It has nothing to do with that. It's old. It's well-established. It's populated by great, great minds and very courageous leaders. And we are simply part of that tradition. And we're forwarding that tradition. And one has to be proud of that. And if one is not proud of it, one is self-conscious about it, well, then they're not ready. They're not ready, and they need to learn more, right?
So how do you feel about, what some people say about the derech of HaRambam, or we see there are some pockets of Maimonidean kind of communities where people say, it seems kind of elitist, or like ivory-tower Judaism, where it's not kiruv oriented and so on. Do you ever hear those kind of arguments?
I do hear those kinds of arguments.
And do you find them to be
I find them to be ill-placed.
Okay, great.
I find them to be ill-placed because, first of all, I don't know, kiruv, I don't know. I'm not a kiruv person. I mean, Baruch Hashem, I'm grateful that I've had the zechut to bring people closer to Torah and mitzvot. I mean, that I'm not afraid to say. I'm grateful that that's been part of my life, and please God, I hope to be able to do that in my life. So whether there's the karev, people, to bring people closer, why should we not do that? I mean, it's part of the whole thing. The kiruv movement, I'm familiar with, but it's not in my circle. I'm not educated in that movement, and nor am I trained in that movement, and I'm not familiar with it in terms of my own practice and my own way. I mean, so that's all I'll say about that. So I don't want to speak about something that I'm not, personally aware of and properly educated in. But to say that HaRambam's approach is not opened and to bringing people close, I think that's also, it's either a failure in scholarship and literacy in HaRambam's writings, or it is maybe an elitist reading of HaRambam. It is true that HaRambam does hold a very high bar, right? In other words, that there are various levels that a person can achieve. It does, the HaRambam does write that, yeah? I mean, that there's, but again, those levels are valuable and important, because if we just expect that no matter what we do, we are at the same space with God all the time, it also cheapens the relationship that we have with God. That's something that people don't take into consideration. There's another side of that coin, yeah.
Yep.
And so I think that there are many entry points to approaching HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaRambam talks about darkei teshuvah, right? There are pathways to teshuvah. And he says there are many pathways. And he'll write, mid darkei teshuvah, among the pathways of teshuvah are this, and among the pathways of teshuvah are this. He writes in more than one other places other than Hilchot Teshuvah. He says this is mid darkei teshuvah, right? This is something that we do as a way of getting close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he writes there's many things that we're supposed to do, should do, could do, in order to be able to engage with others. I mean, so the HaRambam made concessions as well. Yeah, I mean, he writes in the Mishneh Torah that we have to do the Hazara, right, in the Amidah. And he writes in the Teshuvah that they didn't do the Hazara because nobody was answering Amen. And so he took that out, right, because it's not kavod. Right? It's not kavod HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be able to do that, right? Okay, so could you imagine, a minyan today that's been doing Hazara all the time and all of a sudden says, something, people are answering Amen, we're going to take the Hazara out of the Tefillah. Okay. What is that? I could imagine all kinds of, drama and political upheaval happening as a result of such a thing. So, again, it may not be what it is that people are modernly used to, but I don't think that it's true that HaRambam is not, that in studying his presentation of Torah to us, that there's some kind of ivory tower in which the Torah is held that only a select few are able to achieve. That's just patently false.
Well said.
But I'll say one thing. I will say another thing. In this Sfaradi, certainly at least the Middle Eastern Sfaradi minhag, there is when we take the Sefer Torah out of the Hechal, there we have the rimonim, which are the bells, right? The silver, the silver. And we usually will give that to a child. A lot of times we give that to a child to be able to crown the Sefer Torah. And there's a rule, there's like an unspoken rule, right? That the person who's holding the Sefer Torah is not allowed to lower the Sefer to the child so the child can put the rimonim on the Sefer. You have to lift the child up to the Sefer so that they can put the rimonim on the Torah. And that is an analogy in general, right? We don't lower the Brit. We don't lower the Torah to somebody who's not yet able to reach it. We either lift them up, right? We give them boosts, right? We give them step stools to be able to get there, or we wait till they grow to the point that they're able to do it. But we don't lower it in order to be able to get to the people. And that's a very important principle that people forget. And sometimes I'm concerned that people do that. In their eagerness to be able to give people connection, they lower these bars, right? They lower the values in order to be able to have access, rather than assisting and escorting towards the higher level that people can get to. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to cheapen it that way.
Excellent point. We want to also ask, and this question is targeted more for teenagers when we're going to ask this question.
Mm-hmm.
For teenagers today that are surrounded, I would say maybe with, woke culture that focuses on the individual, me versus we, there's, how do we properly present Torah to teenagers that are accustomed and being trained and kind of being surrounded with this very me versus we individualistic kind of society that's surrounding them? How do we go about that?
Right. So, I mean, as I understand your question, there's an assumption in your question, if I understand it correctly, And that is that the me is problematic. And I reject that. I don't think that the me is at all problematic. The only time that the me is problematic is when the me is void of recognizing that the nature of an individual, certainly a human individual, is by definition socialistic, right? In other words, it is a socially inclined existence. So the best line for this, the most pithy, succinct, clear line for this is Hillel HaZaken. And it's honestly, it's one of my favorite lines in Chazal, which is, and that's just me. And Hillel HaZaken was one who spoke about this in various ways, right? This was very much something that Hillel HaZaken held. And that is that he said very famously, to the point that it's almost cliche, but it should never get to be that, because it's much deeper and profound than people may give it credit for. And that is in anili mili. Right? If I am not going to be for me, which means if I'm not going to live my life, if I'm not going to take care of me, if I'm not going to be me as I am, then who will? And what he's saying is that nobody will, right? It just will not happen. And if we disregard that, we are disregarding a fundamental principle in Torah, right? Next week in Perashat Kedoshim, we're going to read Haremot Kedoshim. We're going to read the very famous pasuk, Ve'ahavta l'ra'acha kamocha. And the end of it, and that's really it's an odd pasuk, because if the Torah wanted to simply tell us to love others, then it should have simply said Ve'ahavta l'ra'acha ani Hashem. No, the referent is kamocha. You have to love others as you love you, which is expecting that there is this value of loving oneself. Right? In the Pirkei Avot, second perek, if people are reading Pirkei Avot now between Pesach and Shavuot, we're likely in the second perek, right? There's two things. Ye mamon havercha haviv alecha keshelcha, right? It's always the referent. The referent is always the self. And there's always an expectation that there is going to be a love of self. And if one does not have a love of self, and what I mean by that is the genuine self that one is, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created you to be, which is unique, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't create cookie-cutter people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created absolutely unique individuals, and that is part of the expression of the Yehud HaBoreh, right? The fact that Hashem is Ehad, His creations, the one ubiquitous stamp on creation is the unique individuality of creation. You don't have two leaves on a tree, not two snowflakes, not fingerprints, all of that, right? We see identical twins, and we freak out because we can't imagine that there's two people that look the same. It's impossible for us to absorb. So the fact that the modern culture is moving into a very heavy me identity is not a necessarily negative. It is a very important development, because in Western society, we went from being a very, very rigid communal system, right? I encourage people to read Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom. In the US, it's called Escape from Freedom. In the UK, it's called Fear of Freedom. And where he shows the development of Western society from a very collective kind of society where everybody had their place within the society and everybody knew their connection to the broader fabric of society, into a very individualistic, capitalistic move. Now, the truth of the matter is that I quoted only one half of Hillel's statement. All right, the second half of Hillel's statement is Uksheani le'atzmi ma'ani. Right, and then he didn't say Ukshani li, right? He said Ukshani le'atzmi. When I am only for myself, right? When I am by myself, well, then what am I, right? I'm failing to recognize that I, as an individual, exist in an intricate connection with the rest of society. So there are various aspects of self, and one of the aspects of self is in Torah, right? And this is a wonderful show of the balance of Torah's recognition of the individual within the collective. And one should not shift for the other. Yeah, it's like, the whole of Shavuot, everybody agrees. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara. How do you celebrate? How do you spend the day of Shavuot? And, some say, Kulo Lashem, Kulo Lachem, so on and so forth. And everybody agrees that on Shavuot, you need to have Lachem. You need to have you time. right, on Shavuot. There's a whole sugya. I'm not going to get into it right now. You can look it up. But that's a major issue. It says that when the Hachamim would complete a sugya or masechet, not a sugya, but a masechet, or they would complete their learning, they would have celebrations for themselves, right? It says Rabbi Yosef, Hadai nafshai, he would say, right? He would say, oh, I'm so happy, Rabbi Yosef, that I've completed my study. He goes, if it wasn't for my study, kama Yosei kabashuka, how many Joes are there, average Joes are there out in the street? Yeah, so there's these celebrations of individuality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu imprinted in all of us that we must actualize. And for a very long time in Western society, and it still goes in Eastern society, right? But for a very long time in Western society, the individual was erased to a very high degree. So of course, anytime the individual raises his or her head, there is an accusation of selfishness, because people don't necessarily know how to be themselves and not be selfish, right? So that's the difficult edge, right? And the reality is that if a person is working on achieving oneself, sometimes there needs to be private time for that. And sometimes they need to be able to pull away from the klal in order to be able to search. Yeah, that's why Bodedut is a thing, right? The Hasidut brought that, but HaRambam writes the same thing. Right. HaRambam writes in the Moreh Nebuchim that there is a precious, you see, he called it Zmanim Yekarim. The most precious times are the times when you're alone. And you can just consider your life, your thought, who you are, what are your struggles. And that's, so I think that in society, especially with the younger generation, we're seeing a pendulum swing. And yes, the pendulum is swinging to an extreme. There's no question about it. But again, HaRambam writes that as well in Hilchot Deot. Sometimes in order to be able to find balance in the middle, we move to the extremes before we're able to calibrate it. And everybody hates it, right? They're looking at it because the older generation is like, we were selfless. We gave of ourselves. We supplied. We were all part of communities. We were part of the sisterhood. We were part of the congregation. Yeah, you're right. Those are wonderful things, and they should continue. But right now, we're looking at the hitbodedut, right? There's a lot of that going on. And it's true that the society can't run if everybody's going to be spending a bunch of time on their own, doing their own thing. And the pendulum will swing back because it's not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. But I don't think it's evil, right? In other words, it gets to a very bad place. And the truth of the matter is, the source of evil is in isolation, right? In not sensing empathy and care and the need to be able to support and embrace those around us in love and compassion and societal building. Make no mistake, I don't want anybody to think that I'm not recognizing those values. What we need to do is we need to hear the teaching of Hillel HaZaken. And the first is very clear. Im en anili mili. If I do not achieve who it is that I am, and I do not fight for my own individual life and existence as I am, uniquely as HaKadosh Baruch Hu created me, then mili. Ain't nobody going to do that. Nobody has the ability to do that because you cannot control other people, right? We have a hard enough time trying to control ourselves. And that's ultimately a major goal. And on the back of that, but if I don't recognize that I'm a social animal, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created me within a fabric of society, and I need to learn how it is that I contribute of myself, my unique self, to that society, I don't exist. And they will find that they yearn for that connection, right? So they will have all kinds of connections that work for them on a superficial level, but at the end of the day, there's nothing that replaces genuine, real human connection, and that will. And we need certain things to happen. We need people to be able to compromise aspects of their self in order to be able to do that. And people are fighting so hard to have themselves right now that they're not yet ready to be able to compromise. So to answer your question, after all of that, I would certainly speak to them about the value of self in Torah, because that's speaking their language. And if you can speak the first half of Hillel HaZaken to them, you can then speak the second half of Hillel HaZaken to them. But if you don't recognize the reality and truth of the first half, you will not be able to get in, because that's what they're focusing on right now, right? They're meditating on imena nili mili. And that's perhaps the motto of the generation. So if you can't expound upon that from a Torah perspective, the kshani la'atzmi ma'ani will never get a seat at the table. So that's how I would suggest.
Very, very well said. And the last point I want to get into is the Habura, because to us it's such a valuable tool. I want to know, we want to know what it is that inspired you to start such a movement. Why was it necessary? And also, where do you see it in 5-10 years? What is your goal?
Well, I certainly cannot take all the credit for it because it wasn't mine. If it was left up to me, it would never happen. I've always, I mean, over the years, my students have asked me, what do we read? What do we learn in order to be able to get the perspective that you have, Rob, right? They would ask me, like, well, how do we? I don't know. You have to just read. There's a lot to read and a lot to know and a lot to, there's a lot of things, and read this and read that. During COVID, my dear friend and Talmid, Sina Kahin, said, we can do this. This is a way we can do it. Yeah, I mean, it was just the right time because during COVID, everybody was online. And I tried to do things online before COVID. I wanted to very, very much do them before, but just people didn't even know what Zoom was. They had no idea, how to kind of, and if they did, it wasn't something that was easy. So we took advantage of that, and so I was kind of able to provide the framework for it and the curriculum for it and kind of what is it we wanted to teach, and Sina just amazingly, as he is, in all that he does, just amazingly facilitated it, and he's blessed with that tremendously. So I'm very grateful to him for that. What ended up happening as a result, so the goal, was to be able to put out this teaching and have people, have an ability to learn. But what ended up happening, to my great delight and surprise, is that it ended up creating a virtual community, right? So thankfully, we're in 26 countries now, the Habura. And when I go around and I speak, I was just recently in Great Neck, I met you guys, and I was in New York, I was in Chicago, I was recently in Seattle and LA. I'm going back to Mexico City in May. Thankfully, everywhere I go, people come up to me and say they're members of the Habura. And what it has done is created a virtual community of people who are drawn to, who feel at home in this approach to Torah, which I've said already is very old. We're doing it in a very new and modern way, but it's really very old, and it's very authentic. So that has been a delight. I'm so glad and grateful that there is, when I was growing up and when I was going through my learning, I felt very alone, with regards to it. There was a handful of people that I knew were like-minded, and that was it. But this has given it's facilitated people that otherwise were isolated to really connect with each other, and feel that they are part of a greater community. And that gives energy. If nothing else, it gives energy, to people, and it gives a central element of it that I think is helpful. In 5 years, I have no idea. I'm always hesitant when people ask me what I think is going to be in 5 years, because I'm going to be 48 years old, which is not 80 years old, but I've lived enough 5-year cycles in my life to know that 5 years, a lot can happen in 5 years. So I have no idea what will be in 5 years. What do I hope? Also, I'm afraid to dream too small. I don't want to do that either. But I do hope that it'll grow, that we'll be able to have perhaps centers. Physics. The online thing is great, but I hope there'll be physical centers, because, like I said, the physical connections between people is very valuable. We're going to be opening here at Bet Midrash in London, B'ezrat Hashem, in the not too distant future for the Habura and the S&P. So I'm very excited about that. But I just, the goal is to be able to facilitate people to be able to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu as much as they can. And if we can help with that, then Hinei Matov, and however it is that it manifests. So I encourage people to be able to take part in it if they can, and to share it. I just hope that it goes Mechayim L'Chaim.
It's really an amazing thing, and we benefit from it a lot. And
Great.
We want to thank you so much for all that you do, and your wisdom, your courage. We really look up to you, and we hope only good things for yourself and the Habura. and hopefully we can do this again one day.
Shebishiflenu zachar lanu. It means so much to me to hear that, and it's a tremendous encouragement. And I, please God, a little bit of what you said, I could hope to, to fill, but I'm very grateful for it, and please God, we'll be able to continue to do it. Thank you
So much.
Yeah.
Right. All the best.
Shabbat tov. Shabbat tov.